It's River to River from IPR News. I'm Ben Kiefer. Today, a real treat. We travel back more than 100 years to the first decades of the 20th century, where a saloon on East Court Avenue in Des Moines was, in the words of the Des Moines Register, the wickedest place in the wickedest section of Des Moines. Its owner, Erastus Wallace Scott, and his cousins in the so-called Carter Gang ran a campaign of murder, of fraud, prostitution. It all made news in Des Moines hundreds of times between 1900 and 1920, and then vanished almost entirely from memory. By 1920, the saloons, the brothels had been razed, a police station went up in their place, and later federal courthouses. And the people who'd terrorized that neighborhood for a generation were simply forgotten, even, as it turns out, by their own families. And that includes my guest today, Rose Donovan. A few years ago, her husband, David Donovan, a retired lawyer with a hobby of genealogy, started digging through old newspaper archives, looking into her family tree. What he found was a 1912 headline calling her great-grandfather, quote, a notorious crook. And that was just the beginning. The Donovans spent years chasing down court records, land deeds, and more than 700 newspaper articles to reconstruct this whole sordid story, which they've now published in a book, The Nastiest Saloon in Iowa, Murder, Prostitution, and Corruption in the Heartland. David and Rose Donovan join me in the studio. Welcome to both of you. Nice to see your faces.
Thank you. This is a great opportunity for
Rose,
us.
Thanks for having us.
You don't look criminal at all, Rose. None of that transfer.
Luckily, it stopped with my great-grandfather.
Okay. Before we get to this fascinating story that people who are interested in the history of Des Moines will definitely be glued to, let's talk about the discovery of this story. Walk me through the moment you realized this wasn't just an interesting find, it was a book.
Well, it really started with finding the newspaper article, from 1912 after Scott's death, that the family had known about for a while. But that was really pretty much all the family did know about. And so I found that article. I found the articles that article referenced until it brought me back to a murder in 1905 that Scott had been accused of after his death. And those articles led me to the cousins that were allegedly involved in the murder, including one who was indicted for the murder, which led me to another story about a murder that Scott had committed 2 years earlier. Scott himself had committed 2 years earlier, which led me to more stories about then the Carter Gang, and then all the fraud, the land purchases, just the other criminal behavior that the gang had been involved in. A lot of theft, a lot of fencing. In the 19-teens, we discovered they operated one of the biggest fencing operations in the history of the state. But it was just a trial here, a trial there, a fraud claim here, a murder there, divorces and abandonment of the family, and just more and more and more and more until the more we talked about it, we thought this is no longer a family history story at all. This is a story about Des Moines that no one remembers.
Yeah.
I kept telling him to stay out of my family tree.
Was that in earnest?
Sometimes it was. He kept coming to me and saying, "You can't believe what I found now." And I kept saying, "Stop looking."
These are family skeletons I want to keep in the closet.
That's right,
Perhaps
exactly.
something like that. And it's interesting, your backgrounds here fit perfectly for writing such a book. David, you're a retired litigator. Quickly, you spent your career doing?
Litigation of all kinds.
Yeah, okay. And Rose, you have a journalistic background.
That's
so
right.
Do you. Yeah.
That's right. We met in journalism school, actually, and we were journalists together at a newspaper in Florida, and then he applied to law school, and then the legal career started, and I stayed in the newspaper field.
Mm-hmm. Let's dig into the story itself, because it is really amazing, especially for those of us who live in Iowa and those of us who know Des Moines. Who wants to set the scene for listeners who's never heard of any of this? Who was Erastus Wallace Scott, and what was the East Court Avenue area in Des Moines like? And let's go back to 1905, Rose?
Right. Yes. Yeah. Erastus Wallace Scott was my great-grandfather. He was my grandmother's father. And we knew nothing about him. He had died before my dad was born. And we knew nothing about this Court Avenue area or the seedy, sordid neighborhood that his bar was in. We didn't even know he had a saloon. And so this was all news to us. But that area of Court Avenue, just over the bridge from what's now downtown Des Moines, sits in the shadow of the beautiful gold-domed Capitol building. And back then, the Capitol building was fairly new. It had been built in the, I guess, late 1880s or something. But the neighborhood was a slum, basically. It was ramshackle buildings. It was saloons, with Erastus Scott's saloon being the most notorious among them. It was prostitutes. He had a brothel above the saloon. It was crime-ridden. It was the epicenter of crime and prostitution in Des Moines just after the turn of the century. And I mean, who knew? I grew up in Iowa. I grew up in Des Moines. I had no idea that this history was part of Des Moines' story.
Right, and you have plenty of pictures in this book, vintage archive photos of what a slum area looked like. I guess to picture it without looking at it would be to think of a Hollywood set. That's what it reminded me of. Really slummy, not a fancy Hollywood cowboy town, but really a slum.
Yeah, ironically, the nicest building on the block was Scott's Saloon. It was a brick 2-story building, and everything next to it were these slummy little 1-story wood, ramshackle dumps that were mostly rented out to prostitutes. The area was so grim and so dangerous around 1903 when the city was looking to concentrate the brothels into a single area that the prostitutes and the folks renting the rooms for the prostitutes didn't want to go to East Court Avenue. It was just too darn dangerous. And so what the city did was they beefed up the police presence on East Court so that it would be safe enough for the prostitutes to engage in their business.
And we'll get into how that provided revenue for the city. But first of all, I want to have, I think you, Dave, you've got the book in front of you. The book opens with a murder of Edward Gresser. This you purport to be Iowa's first drive-by shooting. He was shot through his own kitchen window by someone in a buggy or someone waiting in an apple tree. I don't know if we know that. Des Moines' first drive-by shooting.
Des Moines first.
But
right.
no cars yet.
No cars yet. Not then. The Gresser murder is kind of the through line of the book. It's where we start because the Carters, one of the Carter brothers was indicted for it, and Erastus was at least tangentially related to it. We revisit it in the middle of the book after Scott's death when, for the first time, he is publicly accused of having actually been the shooter. And then we touch on it again at the very end of the book in 1918 when the last member of the Carter gang is accused of the crime. It's actually never solved who the shooter was, but we do know that 3 members of the Carter gang, Will Carter, Erastus Scott, and then this other gentleman, Dutch Cross, were the only people alleged by the police to have been involved in it. But I've got a section of the book that I'd be happy.
Please. Okay, yeah. Dave Donovan reading, his co-author along with his wife, Rose, reading from the Nastiest Saloon in Iowa, Murder, Prostitution, and Corruption in the Heartland.
On the evening of Monday, October 2nd, 1905, Edward Gresser stood in the orange glow of his kitchen lamp, filling his pipe. He had been out most of the day, but before he left his home that morning, he had tacked a note on his door for his neighbor, Will Carter, whom he had expected to come by to discuss the sale of the farm. Gresser, a 34-year-old bachelor, had bought his 70-acre farm in Avon, just southeast of Des Moines, 2 years earlier, from a family who had been farming there since the 1850s. In the couple of years after he bought the farm, Gresser became friendly with his neighbors in Avon, including Carter, better known as W.L., who had owned one of the neighboring farms since the 1880s. Although still nominally a farmer, Will, ran a local business as a bail bondsman, and he and his mother, Sarah, were active real estate investors. As Gresser stood in his kitchen that October evening, he did not notice that a horse-drawn buggy had pulled up in front of the farmhouse. Gresser was faintly lit by a kerosene lamp burning on his kitchen table where he had been reading a newspaper. He stood and walked to a window where he pulled out a match to light his pipe when a bullet crashed through the window, struck him in the head, and killed him. He collapsed to the floor in a pool of blood, a, quote, ghastly bullet hole, close quote, in his temple. Gresser's body lay on the kitchen floor for days until discovered by a neighbor. His hat bearing the bullet hole and pipe lay on the floor beside him. The coroner determined that a bullet had struck him in the side of the head above the temple and exited from the side of his neck. The downward course the bullet had taken made it almost certain the shot had been fired from someone either seated in a buggy or perhaps lying in wait in the branches of an apple tree outside the window. 2 days before Gresser's murder, but before the neighbor's discovery of the body the following Friday, W.L. Carter left his office in downtown Des Moines to file a deed with the Polk County Recorder's Office. That deed, bearing the signature of E.J. Gresser, reflected Gresser's sale of his farm to Carter for $1,700. The deed was dated September 25, 1905, a week before Gresser's death.
Okay, that is Dave Donovan reading from his new book, co-authored with his wife Rose, The Wickedest, I was quoting, The Nastiest Saloon in Iowa, Murder, Prostitution, and Corruption in the Heartland. We have to go to break in a few seconds, but Rose, when did you find out about that drive-by shooting in your family?
I don't think we knew about the drive-by shooting in the family. Dave discovered this in his excavation of my great-grandfather's life.
Okay, so you got over hiding the skeletons and you brought them out of the closet and really looked into what was behind that, and it turns out to be a part of Des Moines history and you've done a lot of research here, nobody had written about.
Nobody had written about this. We were quite certain of that. In fact, the only use of AI in this book, the only use, was to search to see if anything was known out there about these events, and nothing was.
Dave and Rose Donovan, The Nastiest Saloon in Iowa, Murder, Prostitution, and Corruption in the Heartland. We'll be back in just a moment with River to River from IPR News. We're back with more of River to River from IPR News. I'm Ben Kiefer. Today, the true story of Erastus Wallace Scott, the saloon keeper, the Des Moines Register called the wickedest man in the wickedest part of town, a killer, a con man, the head of a crime family that terrorized East Des Moines for a decade, over 100 years ago. My guests are David and Rose Donovan. Their new book uncovers decades of murder and corruption hiding in downtown Des Moines in Rose's own family tree. The Nastiest Saloon in Iowa, Murder, Prostitution, and Corruption in the Heartland, the name of their book. Let's talk a little bit about the corruption. We referenced that a little bit here before. Tell us a little bit more about how the saloon was tied into corruption, these brothels there, and how it actually funded Des Moines at this time.
Let's start with the corruption first, because in some respects, I think that's the most interesting thing we found and proved. There were indications in the news coverage of the Gresser murder and as well as Scott's involvement in the previous murder in 1903, that somehow he had some friends inside the police department that were keeping him from being indicted and tried and associated with crimes.
He was like Teflon, if we would use a modern term.
Very much so. and then after his death, even more clear allegations that somehow this guy had been being protected for years and kept out of investigations in jail. And what we were able to put together was, I think, pretty conclusive evidence of who it was on the inside. And it was the chief of the detectives of the Des Moines Police Department, a guy named Eli Hardin, who was present at the 1903 murder that Scott was clearly committed. He was present. He was the lead investigator in the Gresser murder. He continued to be the lead investigator after the initial trial when they were looking for others to blame for the crime. And then he was later involved, we discovered, working for the Carter family in connection with a subsequent fraud trial. And we were able to put together, because we had all the information over a period of about 9 years that pointed to Hardin, we were able to really make the case that it was Hardin who was the guy on the inside that kept these people safe for as long as he could.
And then when Hardin himself got in trouble, and he was no longer able to protect my great-grandfather, and that's when bad things started happening to him. That's when he was arrested and convicted and sent to prison. But that was a long time. He was committing a lot of crimes before he's finally held accountable.
Over a decade, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
And you both found that the city of Des Moines was effectively profiting from prostitution through something called, what a strange word, mulct, if that's the way you pronounce it. These are fines collected monthly from brothels and unlicensed liquor sales, to the point that the mayor reportedly said, what did he say, Dave? He said, you just got to keep the city running. So it was a recognized revenue stream for the city?
Well, sadly, yes. And in fact, as they were working to shut down prostitution in kind of the period between 1905 and 1909, the critics of the city's actions actually blamed the town for living off this revenue, treating it as sort of a license fee rather than an actual attempt to shut down the houses of prostitution. And the revenue was substantial. We talk about it in the book because there was a lot of press about this too. And if I could just read a little paragraph here.
Sure.
Efforts to close down the disorderly houses, as they were often called, faced one major obstacle: money. The fines imposed for selling liquor in brothels provided the city with a great deal of revenue. Under the mulct law, as it was called, a monthly fee, sometimes referred to as a tax or just the mulct, was collected from many locations selling alcohol either in violation of the terms of the license or perhaps more often the many saloons and brothels selling liquor without any license at all. In August 1900, for example, receipts from such fines resulted in the largest sum for a single month ever collected in the history of the police court. Although a subsequent push to close saloons that were operating illegally had cut revenue from the mulct by about $20,000, about $715,000 in today's money, the number of fines imposed on brothels had grown from a dozen or so per month in 1899 to 135 in July 1900 and 189 in August. Des Moines, it appears, was relying on revenue from the brothels to offset the reduction in fines from the saloons. And quoting the mayor, this was in the Des Moines Register, I believe, said the mayor, we've just got to do something to keep the city running.
So knowingly profiting off of this, I guess it's illegal activity.
It was not licensed, and so, yeah, it was illegal activity, but they weren't shutting it down.
And at the same time, these payments keeping the people working in destitution, Rose.
That's right. The prostitutes would have most things taken away from them, and they really had no other way to support themselves. And so they were stuck in this life, and the city was making money off of that. And some of the most prominent people in the city, businessmen in the city, were involved in renting their properties out for prostitution. We name Hubbles. We named the Yonkers brothers. I'm trying to remember who the other names were, but they knew what was happening, and I believe it was Mr. Hubble who said, and for people who don't know them, the Hubbles were very prominent, owned the Terrace Hill Mansion that then became the home of the governors. It's the governor's mansion. And I think it was Mr. Hubble that said, I can't be bothered with this, and I rent, I make money, and the best tenants are the ones that pay me the rent. And they just didn't seem to care. Yeah.
Did the public at this time in Des Moines or in Iowa know about this, or is it really only those involved in this sort of conspiracy?
Well, by around 1908, the public was getting outraged by the disease related to prostitution business. And when the Yonkers and the Hubbles businesses were indicted, and fined, you can imagine the city was careful not to actually indict Mr. Yonkers or Mr. Hubble, but they indicted their businesses because their businesses were renting out all these apartments all over town to prostitutes. And I think the embarrassment of that really was kind of the beginning of the end.
If you've just joined us, Dave and Rose Donovan, my guests, The Nastiest Saloon in Iowa, the title of the book they've just come out with. And a quick word, I know you do this in the foreword or the preface here too. You are trying to be absolutely historically accurate here. Over 700 articles you went to. This is the period of so-called yellow journalism. So we have really sensational headlines, and maybe the facts have to be interpreted through that lens?
Maybe. I was actually surprised at the consistency of the coverage when there were multiple newspapers in Des Moines covering the trials, for example, or covering the indictments. The stories they told were quite consistent, and which I think lends accuracy to them. What I was, and I think what we enjoyed the most, was just the way the stories are written. Nothing's written that way anymore. The adjectives and just everything about it is just eminently readable and fascinating and kind of eyebrow raising. These reporters obviously had a lot of skill as writers.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you to look up, Dave, while I talk to Rose here for a moment, a headline that has the Scarlet Monster in it. But first, Rose, because this is related, one of the wildest threads in this book, let's go back to Eli Hardin, the Des Moines chief of detectives, accused by multiple women of forcing himself on them in his own office. And he was central, as Dave just said, for covering for Scott and the Carters. Talk about Eli Hardin, because it's such an interesting tie-in to today. And you do reference, I think, in the chapter heading, the Me Too movement here. This is, wow.
Yes, we had a drive-by shooting, and then the Me Too hits Eli Hardin. He was accused by multiple women of sexual misconduct and sexual harassment, and these were usually women whose husbands were in jail or had been arrested, and they were there pleading for their...
He knew the vulnerable women,
yes,
and those were his prey.
Yes, absolutely. And it was astonishing, though, to us that at this time, people were listening to these women. And
were not.
Well, they were listening to them because there was the police commission held a hearing on these allegations against Eli Hardin, and it was a hearing that lasted for about 3 days, I think, and there were many women who testified, who came forward, and very interestingly, at the defense table with Eli Hardin was my great-grandfather, Erastus Wallace Scott, purveyor of the Nastiest Saloon in Iowa, and that should have raised some eyebrows that there was a connection here between these men. And Erastus was trying to help in the defense by disqualifying the testimony of these women by proving that they were prostitutes. You couldn't believe them. Or
some irony there.
And the power dynamic here is an alderman at the time said the police chief wouldn't fire Eli Hardin because they are afraid of him. They fear him. So that was the power that kept a lid on this for a long time.
It appears so.
And after a very juicy 3-day hearing, in which these women did get to testify, in the end, this police commission said, he didn't do anything wrong, and they just let it go. But the mayor was getting such pressure to do something about this that he did fire the chief of detectives. Well, he was about to fire the chief of detectives, and I think he quit, actually.
Mm-hmm. Let's get to that reading that I mentioned a moment ago. Colorful writing, an example of the writing in these. Des Moines had several big newspapers at the time, and this is a passage about the Scarlet Monster, which referenced venereal disease, rampant at the time, and certainly connected with this area.
This was a full-page editorial in the Des Moines Register and Leader in 1908, which features a photograph of East Court Avenue, one of the only ones that's known to exist, and right there on the left of the picture is Scott's Saloon. So here's the
This is the editorial from
this
the
is
Des
the
Moines.
editorial. And I'll tell you when I get to the editorial. But outrage was growing against the, quote, awful sacrifice exacted on Des Moines by the, quote, scarlet monster, venereal disease, particularly syphilis. A lengthy full-page editorial in the Register in March 1908 could hardly have been more blistering in its assessment of the health toll from the brothels or its condemnation of the city's failure to act. And here I'll quote, "Lurking in the shadows, shunning the day and thriving in the blackest night, a great, ugly, scarlet monster is fastening its blight upon this fair city, silently, mysteriously. There is wretchedness in its presence, contagion in its breath, and disease and death in its foul touch. And unhampered, it creeps and crawls stealthily everywhere, a long, slimy, slippery trail, claiming its victims by the thousands." Let me provide a little more background for this. The monster, the editorial says, was creating more suffering and adding more to the sum of misery of men, women, and children than any other one factor of evil that besieges humankind. According to the editorial, more than 3/4 of all men in Des Moines were afflicted by the time they were 30 years old. Venereal disease among women, both, quote, those who invite it and, quote, innocent wives who suffer from it through the sole sinfulness of their husbands, accounted for infections of up to 1/3 of all women treated by doctors in Des Moines and 80% of the deaths of women in the city due to inflammatory disease. And yet, the paper continued, quote, Des Moines does worse than nothing. In fact, the paper argued, Des Moines encourages it by extracting license money from the unfortunates who spread their loathsome disease. And then there's another paragraph that actually references Scott's bar. The article, accompanied by some of the few photos that still exist of the portion of East Court Avenue that was home to Scott's Saloon and the neighboring businesses, left no doubt that the notorious saloon depicted was that formerly owned by Wallace Scott. And again, I'm quoting, "One principal street, which begins at the east end of the Court Avenue Bridge for several blocks, is given up almost entirely to houses of prostitution. At one end stands a notorious saloon, the scene of many crimes, even murders, and for years a harbor for criminals and a plotting place for the evil-minded. From this place on there is one wretched shack after another, most of them even more wretched than the wretched inmates who stand in the doors or look from the windows with bleared eyes and pained faces, puffing cigarettes, leering with sickening smiles at passers-by, cursing each other, or indulging in vile jokes. Although barely legible in the photograph, the 2-story building on the corner with the sign reading in part, beer, was almost certainly the site of Scott's former bar."
David Donovan reading from the Nastiest Saloon in Iowa. My guest today, along with his wife, Rose, the co-authors of the book. And we have to place this in context. We may think that venereal disease is treated as it is today and has been for decades. Rose, no antibiotics there, no treatment. So this is really a scourge. This is killing a lot of people.
And it killed my great-grandmother, who was Erastus Wallace Scott's first wife. And that was a rumor that we had heard in my family, that my great-grandmother had died of a social disease. And we really documented that. We tried to document it anyway. And we managed to get her medical records from, she died in the Clarinda State Mental Hospital. And all of the symptoms that she suffered from really mirrored late-stage syphilis.
Not a peaceful death.
Not a peaceful death at all.
Yeah, okay. Got a couple minutes before we go to break. Let me go to you, Rose. What is it like, now that we've heard some more of the details, to find an ancestor of yours was a monster, for lack of a better word here? How did that impact you at first?
Well, it kind of explained a lot to me because, I grew up in a fairly dysfunctional family. My dad was grandson to this man, and my dad was not a bad man, certainly not like Erastus, and it sort of confirmed rumors that we'd heard, nothing really concrete at all. But it started to make a little bit of sense about, I knew that my grandmother had suffered from some unnamed malady. She was raising her 6 children, including my dad. And yet she would take to her bed for days and weeks at a time, is what I'd heard. And yet she lived well into her 80s. And so I now think she suffered from PTSD from, having been through what she did as a child with this bad man, her father, who left the family when my grandmother was a teenager. And it made me very curious about kind of generational trauma and what my family went through. And yet there was no one to ask anymore.
Back in just a moment with more of my conversation with the co-authors of a new book, The Nastiest Saloon in Iowa, Murder, Prostitution, and Corruption in the Heartland, Dave and Rose Donovan. Fascinating things yet to come as we hone in on some more aspects of Iowa history from over 100 years ago. We'll be back with more River to River from IPR News. We're back with more of River to River from IPR News. I'm Ben Kiefer, learning about a history of Iowa I would bet you never knew of. The Nastiest Saloon in Iowa, Murder, Prostitution, and Corruption in the Heartland. I have its authors with me today. They released in mid-June of 2026 a new book. Their book, David is a retired litigator, and Rose is a retired journalist who worked as a reporter and editor at D.C. area suburban papers, later as a copy editor at the Washington Post. They both were educated in journalism. Before the break, Rose, we were talking about what a surprise it was here. For you to unearth this aspect of your family history. That's only, 3 generations ago. It just really demonstrates how deeply things deeply things are buried and how quickly things are buried in a family narrative. Talk about that.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. My grandmother seemed to not tell anybody, and certainly not her children, about her own childhood, about her father, about what a notorious criminal her father was, right there in the very neighborhood where she was raising her 6 children. And he was gone certainly before my dad was born. And she just never talked about it, apparently. My dad knew none of this. And my dad's been gone for a while now and is clearly turning over in his grave right now, that we're airing these family secrets. But it was so odd to me that nobody knew anything. And my dad was, like I said, one of 6 children. There were 5 boys and a girl. And the one person that I thought might have known something was my aunt, Margaret, my dad's older sister. And she apparently didn't know the story, or whatever she knew, she didn't share. I was talking with one of my cousins about this, and my cousin said, Aunt Margaret said the Scott family were a bunch of scoundrels and horse thieves. The less said about them, the better. Mm-hmm. And that's it. That's all that was known. There was a rumor that Erastus had suffered a scandalous death, and that his first wife had died of a social disease. And I think that was all that was known before we started this.
Rose, since this is your family ancestry here, did you have hesitation about making this so public? Was there any tug at you in the other direction to keep stories like this buried? And then after a few more generations, there would be really difficult. It would be really difficult to uncover what you did.
Well, not really. I'm a journalist, and it's a great story, and that story, spoke to me. And certainly, as it started to look like a bigger story of the history of Des Moines, it really felt like this just begged to be told. Mm-hmm. We have joked that my great-grandmother or my grandmother will be haunting me for spilling all these family secrets, because they really apparently tried awfully hard to not let these secrets get out.
Any blowback from your family, Rose, now for airing this? Is everybody in agreement? Oh, it's fine to bring it out.
Yeah, I mean, my parents are gone. My older siblings are gone. My dad's family is gone. There's nobody left really to complain.
Well, it's interesting that her family is not the only ones that didn't pass this down.
Oh, that's true.
I spent weeks, if not months, reaching out to living descendants of the Carter family, the brothers who were the criminals, their siblings, their descendants, Mary Flynn, Rose's great-grandmother. I found the descendants of her brother that went with her to the asylum in Clarinda in 1908. Nobody knew anything about, and I have not found anybody, any living descendant of any of these families,
and it wasn't just
anything about this.
They weren't just covering up. They were authentically in the dark.
Absolutely. And they were very curious about it and really anxious to learn more from me about it because they knew nothing.
They're all by the book.
Yeah. Yes. Dave, Rose just mentioned being haunted as a joke there, but it reminds me of a section in the book that is, I had to laugh out loud. It was probably the biggest laugh out loud moment. And you, as a litigator, retired litigator, would be able to tell us about some evidence that was not admitted. It was evidence from a ghost, but it was not admitted because it was from a ghost. But why?
Well, this was in the course of the initial investigation before the grand jury of the Gresser murder. Somebody came forward claiming that they had spoken to Gresser's shade, which I had to look that up to see what that meant. And at the time, that meant Gresser's ghost. And apparently this guy said to the detective that Gresser's ghost had come to him and told him that it was all about land fraud and that he could point the finger at the guilty party. And the detective didn't respond, "You're crazy, you can't talk to ghosts." His response was, "Well, I can't have you testify to the grand jury about this because that's hearsay. If you can bring the ghost in, then we'll hear from him." And apparently that was the end of that lead.
But the context here is important too. The early 20th century was really spiritualism, I think it was called then, was really widely believed.
Mm-hmm, that's true. Well, it's a bit of an aside for the book, but it was such an interesting story that we did devote a chapter to it, and that's the story of Count Nathu, who was in Des Moines between about 1908 and about 1914, and he was a supposed Indian Hindu priest, royal member of the Indian royal family. And his only connection to this story is that he was briefly married to Scott's second wife, Lulu, after Scott's death in 1912. I can't begin to summarize the story of this guy because it's so bizarre, but it was so bizarre that we couldn't leave it out of the book. And his tale goes from Wisconsin to Illinois to Iowa to Des Moines to Iowa City, then down to Missouri, ends up in Oklahoma. And it's only about 7 or 8 pages, but it's got to be read to be believed.
Dave and Rose Donovan, The Nastiest Saloon in Iowa is the title of their book. Let's talk a little bit about where this intersects with Iowa today. Court Avenue in Des Moines, one of the most popular nightlife and dining strips in downtown Des Moines, the old red light district, now the historic East Village, the site of federal courthouses, police headquarters. Ironically, I think what you say, sitting right on top of Scott's Saloon where it once stood?
Yeah, it's a federal office building. I believe until just recently it was part of the bankruptcy court, the federal bankruptcy court system. Today it's been, I think, repurposed for other commercial purposes, but it's directly across the street from the police headquarters.
And the police headquarters is right across the street from where the saloon was.
Mm-hmm. When you walk these streets, and I have to believe for this book, with all the work you did researching it, you walked these streets many times. Is there anything left from that period, even if it's the smallest thing? Is there anything left?
There's nothing left. It's all gone. It's all gone. In fact, the police headquarters, the municipal building across the street, when their application to be on the National Register of Historic Places was submitted, it actually says that the police headquarters was constructed on that street basically to eliminate finally all the vice from East Court Avenue.
Mm-hmm. Rose, what runs through your head when you've walked those streets and think about the history, your family history that has happened there?
Well, it does make me sad that we can't find any of we can't find the saloon. The saloon's not there. We've looked for where my great-grandfather lived, the various addresses that we had for him, and it's all gone. And it does seem like an erasure of not only family history, but Des Moines history as well.
Mm-hmm. I started off my first mention of this introduction with taking our listeners on a bit of a time travel. I want to have you engage in that exercise right now, if we could, as we close in the end of this conversation. If you could travel back and spend an evening at Wallace Scott Saloon on East Court Avenue, let's just say you're an anonymous observer, you're not tangled up in this web in any way, but you're also unable to interfere. What would you pick as a day or a night, and what would you want to see, perhaps questions that you've had that you couldn't uncover with your incredible research here?
Well, I would want to see Erastus himself. I think he was, as Rose indicated earlier, he was a very handsome man. And we've got one image of him wearing a three-piece suit, leaning back up against his bar. And just to have been there for an evening and seen how he interacted with the patrons, and just how bad these people were, because from all the newspaper accounts, it sounds like this was the worst quality of people in Des Moines, in the worst section of Des Moines, in the worst saloon in Des Moines.
But also attracting not just the worst people of Des Moines, but other people to the area.
I'm not so sure. I think these were the worst people in Des Moines.
Okay.
Well, it did attract.
Trying to be charitable. Thanks for correcting me, Dave.
It did attract the Christian temperance movement at the time. These saloon preachers, I think they were called, and they were trying to reach the sinners where they were. And they came through Des Moines, and they went right to Erastus's saloon, and they held a temperance revival meeting there. And there were, according to the newspapers, there were about 100 people there, all on their knees, and Erastus promised to give up the drink, give up the saloon, give up that life. And the papers reported this. But the next day they reported that there he was behind the bar, slinging drinks, as always. And so his conversion seemed a little less than believable.
Mm-hmm. The same question for you, Rose, that I asked Dave. Where would you go in this setting that is covered in your book? What conversation or scene would you perhaps want to witness as a neutral observer?
I don't know that I would even really want to go to the saloon. I mean, I guess I would be curious.
Nothing can happen to you. Okay? Did I say that? Nothing can happen to you.
I am interested in who he really was as a person. And really shockingly, the one picture that we have of him, that picture that Dave references of him leaning back against the bar, he looks just like my dad. It was eerie when Dave found that picture and brought it out to me and said, "Look at this. Looks exactly like my father."
He looks supremely confident, and he's a good-looking fellow.
He's a good-looking guy. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so he knows he's at the top of his game in that picture?
Yeah, absolutely. But I'm way more curious about the effect that that life and his behavior had on the rest of the family. I'm really way more curious about my great-grandmother and my grandmother than I am the bad man. I do kind of want to know what made him so bad, and we never really find that out. Yeah. But I'm very curious about that, I think, more than what was going on in the saloon.
So, Rose, let's take your actual great-grandmother. By every account, we could say the person most wronged in this whole story. If she could read this book, what would you want her to know that you couldn't fit on a page?
I think that I would want her to know that I care about her, and that I'm really sorry for what she went through. Yeah. And through apparently no fault of her own, and that her family in 100 years would be reading about her, would be thinking about her. She wouldn't be lost to history.
David, I want to talk about the legal landscape then and now. You are a former litigator. I wonder what struck you most about how differently criminal trials worked in the 1900s in Des Moines, jury selection, rules of evidence, what counted as proof. I don't know where your expertise and your career as a litigator overlaps here, that you maybe raised an eyebrow and said, wow, that's really different.
Well, of course, all we know is the newspaper accounts. There's no transcripts of the hearings, at least that we could find. But the newspaper accounts are quite thorough. And I think the part of it that surprised me the most was the interaction between the attorneys for both sides and the judge. and the papers describe it in great detail. It was crazy. It was angry. It was
a circus.
Rude. It was a circus.
And people showed up for these trials.
Oh, and the courtrooms were packed. This was
entertainment.
This was and it was also probably the most prominent murder in Des Moines history up to that point. Certainly, it was the longest criminal trial in the history of Polk County up to that point. And the whole town was paying attention to it. The aggressor was so well known, his murder was so well known, that in 1918, when the last man gets indicted for that killing, they just referred to the aggressor murder in the headline, knowing that everybody in town knew exactly what they were talking about. But as for the trial itself, I think you have to read the accounts of the way the lawyers spoke to each other or shouted at each other, and the way they spoke and shouted at the judge, and what the judges had to do to try and keep order to this circus. That kind of thing is kind of well beyond my experience or that of anyone that I know. Judges wouldn't tolerate that.
W.L. Carter faced the death penalty in a case that was built heavily on circumstantial evidence or coerced or bought testimony as well. Dave, if a case like this came across your desk, what safeguards exist now that simply didn't then? I don't know if this is your area of law.
Well, I didn't do really hardly any criminal work. I was a civil litigator, but a lot of the rules of evidence apply to both. I'm not sure that his lawyer did a bad job in any respect, because his antics appeared to have persuaded the jury, or at least gotten their attention. And in the end, the story wasn't merely mostly circumstantial. It was 100% circumstantial. There was no one that put Carter at the scene of the crime. It's not even clear to me that the state was clear they were alleging that Carter was the trigger man. They showed quite conclusively that he benefited from all this. But at the end of the day, the state couldn't prove that the signatures on the deed and the sales records and the man who showed up before a notary public to sign the deed and who showed up at the bank to collect the sales proceeds from the purchase, the state couldn't prove that that wasn't aggressor. There was evidence that it wasn't. The aggressor's neighbor said he wasn't even in Des Moines on the day that those events occurred, that he was with them at a farm sale. But at the end of the day, the jury was not persuaded.
Rose, the last word to you in our final minute here. What has this experience been like for you? I mean, any regrets? It doesn't sound like you have any regrets. It's been satisfying. When I look at you, is satisfying a good description? Or what is your feeling, and now that this is all out and the public is experiencing this history of Des Moines?
I think that it's good to know. It's good to not have secrets. And there were secrets that were buried. I think we say in the afterward, they buried these secrets in a cornfield in Iowa and never told anyone where they dug the hole. And, as a journalist, unearthing a story is the goal. And even though this was a family story, I think it was very satisfying to unearth this whole story and then to tell it. Because like I said earlier, it just begged to be told.
All right. We've run out of time. Thank you for coming into our studio today, Dave and Rose Donovan. Again, The Nastiest Saloon in Iowa, the title of their book, Murder, Prostitution, and Corruption in the Heartland. Thank you both for coming in.
Oh, thank you. This has been great fun.
Thanks a lot.
Today's show produced by Caitlin Troutman and Catherine Perkins. I'm Ben Kiefer. Thanks for joining us.